We can see a ton of squash bug eggs on those leaves. They're everywhere in there. There's a squash bug, in fact, right there. What's up, Lazy Dog fam? Hope all y'all are having a wonderful day. It is Sunday, June 30th here in South Georgia, and on today's video we're going to talk about 4 ways to deal with pests in your backyard garden. So as the summer temperatures start getting warmer and warmer, the pest pressure gets more intense, so we're going to talk about things you can do to deal with that. And as fitting as it could have been, after we did that last video talking about our watering schedule during a drought, we finally got a good rain last night. So we're not having to water today, but we are having to do some things to deal with these pests. So let's get started and go through this list of 4 things you can do to deal with garden pests, and then I'll show you some real life examples here behind me. So tip number 1 is rotation. We talk about rotation a lot. We try not to plant the same family of vegetables in the same spot in consecutive years. You'll hear some people say rotation doesn't matter at all. I think it matters a lot and can drastically reduce your pest pressure year over year. Now, if you've got a really small garden, rotation can be hard. It's tough to move things around in such a limited space, and that may mean skipping planting a particular vegetable in one year. If you had a really bad pest pressure on squash last year and you don't really have anywhere else to plant squash the next year, you might want to just give squash a break for a year. That way you just don't compound things. Tip number 2, and this was a hard one for a lot of people, you got to remove those pest-ridden plants even if they're still giving you a little bit of groceries. You got to know when to call it quits, when to get them out of your garden, because at some point you're just providing a breeding habitat for all these bugs. Even if you're still getting a few fruits off the plants, it's better off to get those plants out of the garden if you can. And this is where succession planting comes into play if you've got room to succession plant. So remove those pest-ridden plants and have some more ready to produce in another spot, or plant some more in another spot. That way you can still have a productive garden. You're just not hanging on to those pest-ridden plants for too long. Number 3, and we've talked about this one a lot this year, it helps to have really healthy soil and to feed your plants well so they can kind of push through some pest pressure. Now, as I've told you before, I don't really believe what you'll read out there about a pest not attacking a healthy plant, and I'll show you some evidence of that in a minute. But a nice healthy plant is more resilient. It can kind of push through it as opposed to falling victim to that pest pressure early on. And then lastly, number 4, probably one of the more obvious ones, is that you can spray for pests. Some people refuse to spray anything on their garden, and that's fine. Some people choose to only use organic options, and some people will use whatever they can get their hands on to save their plants. Now, if you've been following our channel for a while, you know I'm not opposed to spraying our plants. I do try to stay organic if possible, try to reduce the harm to pollinators and other beneficial insects, but I'm not opposed to spraying. I haven't found myself spraying as much this year for whatever reason. It's not like I've had some philosophical shift or anything, just haven't got around to doing it. So my plants haven't been sprayed as much this year as they have in previous years. I have used a little bit of spinosad and some of those bug hut products that we have on our website, but not near as often as I have in previous years. So those are the top 4 things we can do to deal with pests. We can eliminate pests, we can reduce them, we can make their presence a little more manageable so we still get some good groceries from our garden. That's why I use the word deal, not eliminate or remove. Now, I've got some really good examples in this plot here behind me with some squash and cucumbers. Let's take a look. So these enterprise squash plants here are just huge. These may be some of the biggest squash plants I've ever grown. This is actually our 2nd squash planting of the year. We did our first in the raised beds and then planted these, I'd say mid to late spring. As you can see here, the leaves still look nice and green. The plants still look pretty dang healthy, and we've still been getting a decent amount of squash off these. But if we take a closer look, we can see a ton of squash bug eggs on those leaves. They're everywhere in there. There's a squash bug, in fact, right there on the edge of that leaf. So that goes back to my earlier point, disputing the argument that bugs won't attack a nice healthy plant. These plants are nice and big and healthy, and the squash bugs have just been loving them, been all over them. But to go back to my third tip there, if you've got some good soil and you feed your plants well, which we've been feeding these a lot with some AgriThrive and Coop Grow, they can kind of push through that intense pest pressure and still give you some nice production. Now, I probably should have pulled these plants a week or so ago, but I kind of want to see just how long they would last with so many squash bugs all in them. We've got a few here that are starting to get taken down. That one there is on its way out, and this one over here is too. But they hung on a lot longer than I thought they would hang on. Probably wouldn't recommend leaving them in the garden as long as we did with so many squash bugs on them, but like I said, I just wanted to kind of see how long they could push through it, and quite impressed, in fact. So even though these plants are still producing, I'll probably get a decent harvest on these before I pull them this afternoon. We got to get them out of here. We got to get rid of this squash bug haven that has been created by all these big, beautiful squash plants. And that goes back to my second tip earlier. Try to remove those pest-ridden plants if you can, and have a succession planting plan, which we have right here. We can see we've got another row of squash plants coming along there, and it won't be long before these are flowering and producing for us as well. So just to kind of recap there, the whole feeding the plants well, that's what's going to help you this year. That's what's going to help you right now. Big, strong, healthy plants that can withstand some pest pressure. Also, the succession planting part, that's going to help you this year, going to help you right now. You've got a backup plan in case your first round or second round of plants starts to get taken down. But the whole part about removing pest-ridden plants, even though they're still a little bit productive, that's something that's going to help you in future years. So getting those plants out of there now is going to mean less eggs deposited into your soil that can hatch next year and cause problems. Now let me give you another example with these cucumbers here. Now these aren't torn up with squash bugs like the squash are. For whatever reason, squash bugs, just like the squash. We do have some pickleworm pressure in here and starting to get a little disease pressure in here. So let's talk about these cucumbers, and we'll also compare these two varieties here a little bit. So let's start out by looking at these Katrina cucumbers here. These are starting to look a little rough. Still getting a decent amount of cucumbers off these, but when they start looking like this at this stage is usually when I pull them and then go to plan B. So let's contrast those Katrina cucumbers with these Supremo plants right here. And these are starting to look a little bit rough as well. Not quite as rough as the Katrina, so I might leave these for another week or two. And let me also try to explain some of the differences in plant size that we got going on here. So you wouldn't know it by looking at them, but these Katrina plants have given us significantly more cucumbers than the Supremo plants here have. Has a lot to do with the fact that these Katrina plants are making all female flowers and don't need pollination, so we're getting a ton of cucumbers off those. Getting a lot of cucumbers off these Supremos, not as many as the Katrinas. But these plants seem to be a little more tough and seem to be a little bit better at climbing the trellis. Could have something to do with the fact that this portion of the row right here gets a little more shade from those pine trees. That may come into play, but I think it's also just some subtle variety differences. These Supremo cucumbers just seem to climb a little bit better than Katrina, although Katrina is more productive. And so as we practice what we preach around here, what I'm going to do later this afternoon, I'm going to pull those Katrina cucumber plants I showed you earlier that are starting to look a little bit rough, and I'm going to plant me some more in this plot behind me here that I just got cleaned up yesterday. I should have did this a couple weeks ago so I wouldn't have such a wide gap in cucumber production, but we've still got time to get another round planted, and we're going to do that in this plot behind me. And while we're out here talking about cucumbers, I thought I'd tell you about a few other things I've observed having these two varieties growing side by side. Now, I know we're comparing kind of apples to oranges here because we're talking about a monoecious pickling cucumber versus a gynoecious parthenocarpic mini cucumber, but some interesting things I've observed nonetheless. So on these Katrina cucumbers here, although these things are just insanely productive, a lot of the fruits, I'd say about half of them, can be a little bit wonky. Now these right here aren't too bad, but you can see kind of the bottom of this one is a little fatter than the top here. This one looks a little bit wonky as well. Now I have heard people say that if you grow a parthenocarpic variety next to a variety that does need to be pollinated, that means these will get pollinated and it can make the fruits kind of wonky like this. I don't know if there's any truth to that, and that may be the reason for what I've been seeing with these. They're still really tasty, nothing wrong with eating them. They're just not the prettiest cucumbers you've ever seen, or at least half of them aren't. So just kind of some funny shapes we see on these, but still getting a ton of them and really liking this variety despite that. Another thing I've noticed, so these Supremo pickling cucumbers right here, which have done really well for us again this year. This one here is probably a little too big. I usually like to pick them smaller than that. Nice, consistent, blocky, but these seem to be more susceptible to pickleworms than these do. So I have had, I don't know, 10 or 15 of these that I've picked that had little holes in them. I tried to find one earlier with a hole in it. Of course, I can't find one when I'm trying to tell you about it, but if you've seen pickleworm holes, little tiny holes in your squash or cucumbers, I've seen pickleworms get after these, but I have yet to see the first pickleworm attack these, which doesn't really make any sense at all, because the skin on these is not near as tough as the skin on these. Now, I'm not going to stand here and tell you that these Katrina cucumbers are resistant to pickleworms, because I don't know that for a fact. But what I can tell you is the pickleworms we have around here, they'll get after my squash, they'll get after these pickling cucumbers, they won't touch these. So I hope you enjoyed the video today, and let me know in the comments below which, if any, of those 4 tips you use in your backyard garden to deal or reduce pest pressure on your plants. And as always, you can find a lot of the seeds for the varieties we talked about today on our website at lazydogfarm.com. And if you want to see how we set up this nice little easy cucumber trellis for these plants, watch this video. We'll walk you through it step by step how we put it all together. So check that out, and we'll see you next time right here at Lazy Dog Farm.